Schlosberg. I'm the chair of the Media Reform Coalition. We're very delighted and honoured to be hosting this event tonight in conjunction with our partners Real Media, the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, and the Stop the War Coalition. This is an issue really that is nothing new, particularly in British progressive politics, but I think for many reasons it's one that matters more than ever at the moment. We produced the Media Reform Coalition in conjunction with academics at Birkbeck and Goldsmith. We produced 2 pieces of research on the media coverage since Jeremy was first elected leader of the Labour Party. Our last one earlier in the summer actually focused on online and broadcasters and found that one of the biggest problems actually is within the BBC, whose coverage was systematically imbalanced, particularly at the peak of the Labour leadership crisis shortly after Brexit. So that's really the backdrop to this event. We did try to engage constructively with the BBC following that research. We got what could best be described as a minimal response. So really tonight's event is a rally. It's not it's supposed to be in any way a kind of open or balanced or impartial debate, and I think that's probably reflected in the lineup of speakers that we have here for you today. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn. They're going to speak relatively briefly, and we're going to try and save at least 40 to 45 minutes for opening up to the floor. So I know this is an issue that's been of concern really to activists, not just associated with Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party, but progressive movements more generally. So, our first speaker tonight is Professor Des Freedman. He's from Goldsmiths University. He's a co-founder of the Media Reform Coalition, as well as a former chair. He's the author of a number of books about the media, most recently the acclaimed Contradictions of Media Power, which really reflects on both the scope of agenda power and control within the mainstream media, but also its limits. Des.
Thanks very much, Justin. And I want to start by misquoting Gandhi by saying that if anyone was to ask you what you think of a free press, I think the best response would be to say that it would be a very good idea. And in that spirit, I want to just quickly go over some of the pieces of research on media coverage of Jeremy Corbyn that we in the Media Reform Coalition carried out. There was three ones to talk about. The first one was looking at coverage of his first week in office, and it found that out of nearly 500 articles, 60% of those articles were overtly negative, only 13% positive and 27% neutral. And you could say maybe that was just a one-off. The next piece of systematic research was carried out by researchers at the LSE, and they found a very similar phenomenon, that the press, as they put it, wasn't a critical watchdog, but it was an antagonistic attack dog, attempting to delegitimise a democratically elected leader. Then, as Justin's already mentioned, just in a couple of months back, our most recent research looked at TV and online coverage of Jeremy Corbyn around the time of the shadow cabinet resignations. And it found, for example, that twice as much attention was paid on the main BBC news bulletins, twice as much attention was paid to critics of Jeremy Corbyn than to his supporters. And you have to think it must be bad when even the former chairman of the BBC Trust, Sir Michael Lyons, insisted on, these are his words, not mine, that there has been some extraordinary attacks on the elected leader of the Labour Party. Now, the fact is, we're told by some people this is okay for 2 main reasons. One is that it's nothing new, that all Labour leaders have faced the same hostility. And secondly, you can't blame journalists because they're just doing their job, because actually they argue he deserves the bad coverage. Well, I was intrigued to see how this holds up as a historical argument. And it is just not, and you won't be surprised by this, it is not the case that all Labour leaders have faced the kind of attacks from the media that Jeremy Corbyn has. So I looked at, for example, the leader who's perhaps closest politically to Jeremy Corbyn, George Lansbury, who actually resigned as Labour leader in 1935 because his pacifist principles were not compatible with the rest of the Labour leadership. But what was the reaction from the press at that time? He was virtually ignored virtually ignored. They certainly didn't say any nice things about him. They were ignored. Look at the other leaders of the Labour Party. I've just got a couple of things. One is that I did it the covers of the Daily Mail, the day after they were elected leader. This is from 1963, and it's Harold Wilson. And you won't be able to read it, but it's on the front page. And this is what the Daily Mail, the same Daily Mail, as I show their most recent front cover, this is what they said. Without wishing Mr. Wilson success in the next general election, we offer him the good wishes which are the right of any man who takes on so onerous and responsible an office. You couldn't think of a more different approach, which is taken up not just by the Mail, but whole sections of the media now. And you see that again, just a couple more examples. The election of Jim Callaghan in the mid-70s, actually very positive from the Daily Mail. And of course, you will not be surprised by what happened in 1994 with Tony Blair, where he gets a very good, a very positive front page about all the tremendous qualities he has. It is Blair's hour. Now, of course, it's the case that both Neil Kinnock and Ed Miliband were mocked and or vilified, but actually not so much when they were first elected. When you compare to the reaction of the Mail to Jeremy Corbyn's election from last September. So just if you just show us, you'll remember this, the next slide. That's what greeted him as soon as the morning after he was elected. So when people say actually journalists are doing their job because they're reflecting on the bad performance, you might want to point out to them that that headline was actually produced on the day that he was elected, before he'd had even the opportunity to do the terrible things that he's alleged to have done. Now, the difference is that Jeremy Corbyn, and I think the movements that he represents, represents a threat to the powerful in a way that right-wing Labour figures never did. That is what underlies the extraordinary hostility to his leadership. And any radical movement that refuses to abide by the usual consensus on austerity, on immigration, on foreign policy, can expect to be either marginalised or ridiculed, to be misrepresented or ignored. And I think that tells you a lot about the balance of power in the mainstream media. If you depart from the rules, you should expect to be punished. But the best response, from my perspective, to this is not to bow down before media power, it's to do the opposite. It's to intensify your campaigning, it's to sharpen your opposition. And I think that's the lesson of history. Trade union rights weren't won by Chartists who developed a clever media strategy. The suffragettes, as far as I'm aware, did not stop smashing windows because it didn't play well in Middle England. And today I suspect that junior doctors will be best able to defend the NHS, not simply by trying to make reasonable arguments on news bulletins, which actually they do when they're given the choice, the opportunity, but by organising the action itself that makes it impossible for journalists to ignore their demands. Now, the Media Reform Coalition has been around for 5 years. We started in response to the terrible abuses of power carried out inside the Murdoch press and elsewhere, something I should add that we were reminded of a couple of days ago when the notoriously left-wing Parliamentary Standards Committee accused both the editor and the legal manager of the News of the World, as it was, of lying to Parliament in the wake of the phone hacking crisis. But our aim was and remains not about blaming individual journalists, but actually fighting and campaigning for the conditions which would allow journalists to do their jobs free from the contamination of proprietorial influence and vested interests. And that remains the case today as we press for changes to media ownership rules and new ways of funding public interest journalism. But for me, and this is where I'll finish, the biggest single boost to a democratic media and to a democratic society will come from campaigns representing those whose voices are largely excluded from mainstream agendas. Because the BBC, Murdoch, Dacre and the rest of what used to be called Fleet Street, they can never hold power to account because they are precisely part of those very power structures. So Jeremy Corbyn, and I think this is a lesson that applies to all progressive movements, Jeremy Corbyn can't afford to rely on an army of spin doctors and communications consultants. He needs to rely, I believe, on the power of his base to expose the inequality, to expose the warmongering and profiteering that is opposed by many millions of British people. This, after all, is exactly the same public, a majority of whom, according to YouGov a couple of weeks ago, also believe that the mainstream media, in the words of YouGov, as they put the question, is, quote, deliberately biased against Jeremy Corbyn. So for me, just to finish, a radical movement today has to make effective use of social media. It has to engage with mainstream media to the extent that it is possible. But above all, it means rejecting and organising against a politics of austerity and desperation and offering and fighting for an alternative that will be hard to marginalise, to distort or to ignore. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. Next up, we have a journalist who is very much operating outside of the Westminster lobby. Cam Sandhu is a writer and editor and co-founder of Real Media, a cooperative of journalists dedicated to real public interest news and challenging mass media distortion. Cam.
I'm from Real Media, which has just got an intro. We have paid a lot of attention to what the Media Reform Coalition have been doing in terms of their research, and as Des said, it's shown a kind of unexcusable bias in the media, and a lot of the public actually are in agreement with the fact that the media is very much biased against Jeremy Corbyn. In July, Roy Greenslade, who's a regular contributor to The Guardian and often comments on media, wrote an article titled, "Yes, Jeremy Corbyn has got a bad press, but where's the harm?" He suggested that the unanimous standpoint of newspapers was unsurprising, that they had a duty to report on the fact that 80% of Parliament were against him, and that he was going to win the leadership anyway. So what was the problem? Perhaps if this was isolated, then this could be defended. But in contrast, we've had figures like Farage, who have been given ample media time when he had no MPs. There's been a legitimisation of his language and his politics, and the words such as illegal and bogus used by newspapers has been found to be used mirrored in street attacks and harassment. The press made little of the fact that he had a £2 million expenses scandal for which other people have been jailed, and they made little of the fact that a school report found that he had fascist tendencies, concern from a school teacher. Instead, this banker was portrayed as an ordinary man, and towards the EU debate, the debate became concentrated on immigration. Words such as austerity, policy, investment, infrastructure fell off the agenda as we started to talk about immigration and immigration alone. You might have noticed that he also went to meet Trump, another man who's also benefited from media time, and they've trivialised racism, fascism through the words controversial. In contrast, Jeremy Corbyn has served in the Labour Party for 33 years. He's a part of one of the two mainstream parties, and yet he's displayed as this kind of outsider. In fact, David Cameron, who, as you may know, voted to bomb Libya, Syria, also voted for Iraq, under whose leadership we sold £5 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, suggested that Corbyn was the national security threat. I started out doing welfare reporting, and that was because there was a massive disparity between what I was seeing, people's experiences, and what was being reported in the media. People like IDS, Ian Duncan Smith, were getting away, particularly when he resigned, as if he kind of had maybe done an all right job. Under his leadership, sanctions have skyrocketed, and I know that I'm standing here talking with Ken Loach, whose new film. It seems to me bizarre that it takes a filmmaker to bring this kind of experience to the forefront when this is happening all the time in the kind of welfare reporting that I was doing. Similarly, he also stopped the release of the benefit deaths related to those who are in the welfare system, perhaps trying to clear out the experiences of someone like David Clapson, who was an ex-soldier. After being sanctioned, his electricity was turned off, his fridge was turned off, and he couldn't access his life-saving insulin. He was found with lots of CVs around him, but he was struggling to get work and told that he wasn't quite doing enough. Instead, I saw people like IDS say that he was helping disabled people, that he was helping make work pay, and this wasn't challenged by journalists. Instead, they became a platform for his disinformation, for his rhetoric about worklessness, and to blame the unemployed for unemployment itself. So perhaps a bad press for Jeremy Corbyn in and of itself does no harm. But alongside a media that also legitimises racism and fascism and also doesn't challenge destructive policies, a lot of harm has been caused. Recently, you might have heard about the Labour purge. Owen Smith continues to say that we need to get 2 million Tory voters back, but the purge seemed to get rid of people who were Green voters in the last election. A comment here from David Graeber says, "The flagrant purge of Corbyn voters from the rolls shows just what reactionaries can get away with when journalists stop being journalists. This in turn means that if you have unanimous press support, you could do pretty much anything and be sure you'll be safe from exposure." I wanted to finish by talking a little bit about the problems when liberal policy is just a veneer. Last month, there were some riots in Milwaukee, and as this has been a Democrat state for a long, long time, people were surprised to realise that it was the most segregated city in America. But these are the places that liberal policy, or the veneer of liberal policy, leaves behind. In the UK, the E15 mums are fighting a Labour constituency. Disabled people told me that it was a Labour government that brought in ATOS, and it's doctors that tell me that it was the Labour government that provided a relay race in the privatisation of the NHS and also in implementing PFI. I recently read Yanis Varoufakis' book, and the weak suffer what they must, which is a good read, I recommend it. But he also talks about the fact that the EU was presented as a liberal idea of unification, when in fact it became used in the interests of corporations, in privatisation, in the destruction of workers' rights. And this disappointment in the people that were told to believe in this project left open a space for the far right to come and exploit that disappointment and that anger. And I'll finish with a quote from that. Leonard Shapiro, writing on Stalinism, warned us that the true object of propaganda is neither to convince nor to even persuade, but to produce a uniform pattern of public utterances in which the first trace of unorthodox thought reveals itself as a jarring dissonance. During 5 months of negotiating with the Eurogroup on behalf of Greece, I bore the brunt of precisely this type of propaganda. My attempts to infuse some rational humanism into the negotiations on my country's fiscal and reform agenda were met with a concerted effort to turn our sensible proposals into a jarring dissonance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cam. Next up we have Professor Greg Philo he's Glasgow University, Research Director of the world-renowned Glasgow Media Unit for over 20 years, which has pioneered, among other things, new research techniques that reveal the complex ways in which audiences and publics are and indeed can be influenced by dominant media narratives. Greg.
I'm going to stand so I can get out of the way of the light. I keep feeling like I'm being interrogated on my past political affiliations, just in case I've said anything on Twitter, you know. Not that I can work it very well. The mic, give me the mic. I'll have the mic. Thank you very much. Look, I can walk with the mic as well. So, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. What I'd like to talk, I'll speak more into the mic. How about that? I'll project. And is everybody now able to hear? Is that okay? All right, okay. I wanted to say thanks for coming tonight. I've just come down from Glasgow, where it's incredibly sunny and hot, so I feel a bit cold down here. That's a joke. I mean, if you looked at the weather forecast, about 10 degrees apart. What I want to say to you is, what can we do about this situation? We all know that the problems, every time we look at the media, we want to scream at it, we want to throw bricks at the TV. What can actually be done? I want to talk about very quickly, three areas. The first is, I think, it's very important for us on the left to use what space is available in the mainstream media. We are very good on social media, but that in effect is confined pretty much to 20% of the population in terms of real use and interaction on anything political, probably less than that. So the mainstream media is still critical for very many people. And what I found is when you ask people what they're looking at online, very often, people say, I use the internet for my news. And then you say, well, what are you looking at? And they say, the BBC website, So actually, it's the mainstream news they're picking up, even when it's online. So how can we use the existing mainstream media? Now, I wouldn't tell anyone to get their hopes up because we know the difficulties and the problems. But nonetheless, there is some space. Papers like the Daily Mirror, even The Sun, watch their own readerships. They're very concerned about their readership. So they must, to some extent, for commercial reasons, represent a range of views, even if it's not the editorial policy. So it's a very important thing for us as a movement to keep feeding in material as much as we can to those sources. A second issue, and I'll speak quick because we can do 5 minutes, but a second key issue is the mass membership that in an extraordinary development, we now have probably over 500,000 members in the Labour Party. Now that is an astonishing thing to have happened. So those people need to make their voices very clear into the mainstream media and to use what public space there is. And that means things like phone-in programs, of which there are huge numbers. It means local programming. It means texting to news services, so the text runs along the screen. It means phoning up the Jeremy Vine show, things like that. And a constant battering into the media and saying, no, you're not representing what people think. There's all these ideas that are there out in the society which are not being represented. Why don't you focus on people's desire for rail nationalisation, for public ownership, not just rail, for electricity, gas, all of these things. To keep going and pushing into those spaces is so important, and it really does work. One of the exercises I do with my students, and honours students, is simply to say to them, use as much space as you can, get as much as you can into the media. And one of the things they do is simply to write letters, which is extraordinary, to the Daily Express, to the Daily Mail. And they're published. Because what they write is, I'm a young university student and a very enthusiastic reader of the Daily Express. But I can't help wondering if the biggest scroungers are not the people who are on Social Security, but the hedge fund managers who, etc. And the letter goes in because it's from a young university student. The Daily Express is desperate to get anybody under 50 to read it. And the Daily Mail and all of these papers actually print these extraordinary radical letters that my students write. And I was astonished. I thought they might get one in, but I mean, they've covered the media unit with these letters. So it's so important to use that, to take that up. Another key issue for the mass membership, in my view, is to organise people to go out literally and appear in public, to bang on doors, to be in public spaces, to talk to people in shopping centres, to give out alternative information, and for us to brief these people with the best, latest arguments that we can give them. It seems to me absolutely critical. And that, because I live in Scotland, I watched this happen with the independence referendum. Now, I was on the no side, but I have to say to you that it was an astonishing sight to watch this army of young people. I mean, this SNP now has 110,000 members. It's an astonishing organisation of people. And I watched these people and read their accounts. Many of them were my ex-students. And I read what they were doing on Facebook, because I'm on Facebook with them. And they would list how they'd gone out every night after night after night, for 6 hours at a time, 7 hours sometimes, all day. And they would say how many people they'd spoken to, how many doors they'd knocked on, how many people. And they moved that vote from 30% up to 45%. I mean, it was in the teeth of the most ferocious media criticism. And it was an extraordinary sight. Now, that kind of interactive politics where people talk to other people is absolutely critical and something we need to move towards. And the last thing I'll say is that the BBC must be held to account. It's a public body, we own it, we pay for it. It must represent our views as well as the proper range of political views. That's its job, that's its charter. It is bound to do that. It is not acceptable for it to conduct itself in the way that has been so well measured by Justin and many other people now who have LSE, Birkbeck. Again and again it's been found that it is behaving in a way which is really quite outrageous. And it has to be called out for that. And I think each time any of us or any of the spokesmen for our movement, for our people, go on to the BBC, they have to point to those research findings to say, this is not acceptable. When are you going to represent a proper range of views? And they need to be called out on air publicly. And that's one of the functions of phoning up, doing the phone-ins, constantly writing and arguing and insisting that the BBC does its job properly. And I'll hold that there, but I'll just say one last word. This is a difficult moment for us. There's all kinds of problems. The Labour Party is going through a strange and tumultuous period. But to turn around a battleship takes a long time. Don't be surprised that it's difficult, arduous, and takes time. And don't expect always to win. But always, always go on. Okay.
Thank you very much, Greg. Next up, we have James Schneider, the national organizer of Momentum, having previously worked himself as a journalist for the New African magazine and Think Africa. He has a unique on-the-ground experience of both being an activist and a journalist, and has played an instrumental role in successive Corbyn leadership campaigns that have, and I don't think this is an overstatement, changed the face of British politics. James.
Thank you very much. So I'm not going to talk about the world of pain that comes through this phone when I have to deal with the media attacks that we get against Momentum every day and also against the Corbyn campaign. Instead, I'm going to talk about something slightly more hopeful from my previous incarnation as Justin was saying, as an Africa journalist. The coverage both of the continent from the outside and also media coverage in the continent is terrible, and it's structurally flawed, and it's intensely biased, and it represents all of the worst power dynamics that exist across societies in a similar or analogous manner to it does here. However, I found that over the last 6 years, although not overcoming these fundamental structural issues, coverage has improved in a number of ways, and there are things that have done that, and there has been a kind of informal counter-hegemonic strategy that people have been employing that has worked. So I want to go through that and then see what elements of that could be applicable to what we're trying to do here, so that we can move things forward somewhat. There's misquoted Gandhi. I'll misquote Jello Biafra, the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, who said, well, he didn't quite say, but we'll say he said, "Don't hate the media, be the media." Now, this isn't just be new media, although that's vital. This isn't just be active on social media, making sure people's voices get heard. This also means changing the institutions that currently exist, because, as Greg just said, there is no point whatsoever ignoring the largest communication organs that speak to the most people. We need to use a strategy that builds on all three of these things to build our own channels, to communicate our own messages, but also to change the institutions that are communicating for us. So, in my experience, there were three pillars which helped change things. So by change things, to say what things still are like, but were more like beforehand. You had the New York Times defending the fact that it uses white characters that its readers can see themselves in when trying to write news stories about different countries in Africa, which they would say this is the only way that we can tell this story is if we put a Western aid worker, for example, as being the main source that is quoted. That practice happens far less. The number of African journalists who are employed by international media organizations to write about their own countries has dramatically increased, and also those who do write who are not from the countries that they're writing about, have in general become more specialist and more embedded and more engaged with what they're doing, which means that the people that they're quoting, they're far more likely to be people who are directly affected by stories rather than what does the investor who owns shares in Randgold think about what's going on in a civil war in Mali, but perhaps what people in Mali think about it. So the first element is new media that is credible, that sits alongside existing media. I worked for one which was called Think Africa Press, which sadly no longer exists, which was a Nigerian-owned news analysis and essays website. And what we tried to do was help develop an empowered and critical constituency that could go and challenge media narratives elsewhere and change the way that things were covered. So developing specialists, making sure that we're employing journalists who were specialists in what they were doing, wanted to develop that, but also getting experts. So, I mean, we know that across every field there is a huge amount of excellent expertise which is locked up behind the paywall in JSTOR and behind incomprehensible language for most people and behind terminology, which needs to be taken out. So credible new media that challenged especially Western narratives. The second, really importantly, was the growth of especially Twitter, number of African Twitter users. So someone writes a crappy story, you tell them it's a crappy story. You tell them why it's a crappy story. You tell their editor it's a crappy story. You tell them all, here are the places in which you should have spoken to this sort of person, that sort of person. This is where your story is flawed, and it has had really, significant, of course not complete, effect, and that increases accountability for journalists. And then the third one is about technological shifts which have changed somewhat the balance of power in domestic media. So to give an example of Nigerian media, and comparing coverage in the Nigerian press between the 2011 elections and the 2015 elections. 2011 elections, the media is entirely dominated by 3 broadcasters and by a fantastically corrupt printed media. 2015, there are 3.5 broadcasters, and it's still mainly dominated by a fantastically corrupt print media, but there are also alternatives that emerge that are able to hold people to account. For example, one was Premium Times, an online newspaper, which was raided and shut down on the eve of the elections by the security services, but they got a tip off and they were able to scatter. And they were able to work with others, including my publication and election observers, to ensure that results that they were getting from across the country got out to people through social media, through other channels, before anybody could play around with them, and helped to safeguard those election results, which did see a transfer of power. So how do we do... So the key thing, I think, in all those 3 things which links them together and helps change traditional media, is this developing of an empowered critical constituency that has to be taken seriously by, let's say, the more liberal end of the forces within the traditional media, which is, generally speaking, structurally opposed to majority interests. And so how can we do the same thing here? How can we link the same 3 things together? So first thing, projects like yours with new media, that has to be high quality, it has to be rigorous, it has to be innovative. What we can't do is have just a cacophony of polemic which can be ignored. We need to be holding ourselves to a higher standards of rigor and a higher standards of credibility than the normal newspapers are covering. And if we fail in those, it's very, very easy for us to be ignored. The second thing, which we are far more able to do now, is produce our own material and get people to write about it, less mediated, at times unmediated. Produce our own videos about what we're doing, produce our own news reports, but of sufficiently high quality that they can be picked up by your traditional broadcasters, by the websites of big media houses, so that they can play them and they can amplify the message. And these 2 things help build, I think, this critical constituency and empower our users on social media, because political Twitter in the UK it's horrible. It's really not a good space, which damages our ability to hold journalists to account and to hold editors to account, because the tone is so aggressive and unpleasant that kind of robust critical challenge that we need to be able to have to hold people to account, to amplify the voices of our movements can be ignored. But I think the developing of our own channels and the developing of new media channels can help to give, as Greg was saying, the best information and the best lines to our people to put those forward to power. And that will help us be listened to and make more of those newsroom conversations say, oh, I did read this thing that said, oh, the thing we did was a little bit off, maybe we should think about that just a little bit. And that just a little bit is a chink, and it's a useful chink, and we start moving on and we build from there. So what I'm suggesting is the battleship turning around is a fantastic analogy, I think, for what we're trying to do in changing the way that we are communicated with and that we communicate with each other. It's a very, very long march through the existing institutions and building our own institutions. But right now, we can work really hard and begin to shift the balance of power just a little bit, give us some more space, some more voices. It's never going to be perfect, but we can make ourselves heard far more effectively than we are now.
Thanks very much. And on that subject, I should just say this is an ongoing discussion, and we really do welcome and ideas from everyone here and beyond. This is a kind of litmus test, if you like, for a series of events that are going to take place throughout the autumn, partly in conjunction with our partners at Real Media. You would have received flyers when you came in about a national tour that's taking place that culminates at Goldsmiths on the 10th of December in our second Media Democracy Festival. There's also a website specifically around that campaign, reclaimthemedia.org.uk, so please do get involved. If you want to tweet tonight, we're using the hashtag #MediaBias. And if you're not already plugged into our networks, do follow us on Twitter, Media Reform UK, or drop us an email, info@mediareform.org.uk. Right, our next speaker is Angela Towers, a feminist and activist, a member of the stunningly successful No More Page 3 team, which since 2012, and she's also been the co-founder of Women Up, an organisation charged with running women-led events exploring the issue of womanhood in the 21st century. Angela Towers, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so this event is the media movements and Jeremy Corbyn, and I suppose that I'm here to represent a movement that we became at the No More Page Street campaign. So to give you an idea of what we were and what we were trying to achieve, I'll tell you how it began. So it began in the mind of Lucy-Anne Holmes during the 2012 Olympics, when she bought a copy of The Sun to read about the sporting achievements of the Olympians and specifically the female Olympians. When she opened The Sun, she found that page 3 wasn't there on that day, and she thought, oh, that's fantastic, we're honouring sort of women for a different reason today. And she was dismayed to discover it on page 11. And the thing that jarred with her on that day, I think, was the fact that the page 3 image on page 11 of the woman in her pants was actually bigger than the image of Jessica Ennis, who had just won gold for her country. And seeing that sort of misrepresentation in such an obvious fashion on that day stuck with her, and she didn't let it go, and the movement grew out of there. So we're classed as a social media campaign, I think, because everything we do is online. So we were made up of a petition, a website, and the way that we would communicate with people was via Facebook and Twitter. So everything that we did was online. We were truly a grassroots movement. There was no money involved, and it was all done on the backs of volunteers in living rooms and kitchens and sometimes bedrooms across the country, was where we would do our work. One of the things that was good for us, I think, that helped us become a movement was the fact that people would lend their voice to us. So we had, women, men, young girls, young boys, everybody who, you know, from different walks of life who wanted to support us. And I put that down to the fact that Page 3 was an iconic image and it sort of become embedded in our culture, and I don't think anybody could argue that it was a good thing. So we had support from all walks of society. But not only that, we were very lucky to get support from women's groups and organisations who gave us their words of support, which we put on our website. We also had cross-party support in Parliament. So again, on our website, we had a whole section dedicated to which MPs supported us. And further to that, we weren't actually looking for any legislation. So I've been in Parliament today, and it reminded me how painstaking the process is, the parliamentary process, and trying to get any sort of measure of change is really bloody difficult when you take it through Parliament. So we were unique in that we went straight to the source. Our petition was asking the person who had the power to make that change to make it, and the way that we were asking him was with collective voices. And I think that was one of the things that made us successful. You know, Page 3 was an ideal target. The person who had the power to change it was being asked, and eventually they did change it, which, you know, is brilliant for us, and it's nice to be considered a powerful movement, which I think we were. Since we've sort of been successful, we continued our work in looking at the representation of women in the news, and particularly in the news. And every week we do a sort of roundup of sexist news articles in our press. We've always got really good material, and actually we've had some brilliant examples this week, including a full page on Theresa May's skirt in the Mail, who ran the headline, "Remember the first rule of negotiating, Theresa, try not to reveal too much." These are our newspapers. These are supposed to be the cornerstone, you know, of society, the thing that gives us information. These are the kind of things that they're printing. As well as that, we had the Sun and the Daily Mail declared that Tory MP Lucy Fraser had a basic instinct moment during Prime Minister's questions, and they helpfully illustrated that with an upskirt shot of the MP in question. So every week we do this sort of silly roundup where we look at the most absurd stories, you know, that are out there. We always have lots of material, and it can be quite funny. But there's this really serious side to the press and the way that it represents women. And during our campaign, the first part of the Leveson inquiry came to a close, and IPSO was created, which is the independent press regulator, and obviously what we've discovered is that IPSO doesn't have to take complaints from third parties or organisations. So whenever they do something really offensive in the press, which they often do, there's no route to redress. There's no way for anyone to complain. So, for example, recently the story of a woman who had died at the Deep Cut barracks, Cheryl her name was. It had come to light that perhaps she may have been raped before she died, and the Sun ran this story with the headline, "Army Girl Locked In for Romp." They used the word romp like it was some sort of Benny Hill comedy thing that had happened. And now, of course, the woman in question, she's not with us anymore, so there's no way that she could complain about the way she'd been represented in the paper, and nobody else could complain either. And further to that, even if we did have the facility to complain, if IPSO were required to listen to our complaints as a campaign group or a charity or an organisation, there's actually nothing in the editor's code, which is what they're enforcing, to say that that's wrong. So very often other things we would find is when Reva Steenkamp was murdered, every single newspaper ran the story with pictures of her in her bikini. In 2014, The Sun ran a 4-page expose about a woman who'd been trafficked into this country and gang raped, and right in the middle of the 4 pages was the smiling Page 3 girl. Now, these newspapers know what they're doing. They're creating this whole entertainment package around sex and sexual violence against women. And it's just a huge distraction technique. Page 3 actually is across from the politics pages in the Sun. So it's like, this is what's going on in the country, but here's some tips for you. They're very smart, they know what they're doing, and it continues to this day, this sort of distraction technique. But I suppose I want to leave you with a bit of hope and to show you that we can change things together, because I do think that we can. I do think that it's possible. It's difficult, but it's possible. So the first thing I want to show you is that the Sun's website in 2013, so very often as a campaign we would be told, why don't you concentrate on more important things like domestic violence or rape rates in the UK, etc. These people obviously failed to see that all of these issues are linked, they're all part of the same thing. When you went on the Sun's website in 2013, if you searched for the word rape, you'd find 6,000 results. If you searched for the word sexual assault, you'd find 2,000, domestic violence, 800. Compare that with the amount of articles you'd find if you searched for the word boobs, which was 7,000, babe, which was 10,000, and sexy, which was 20,000. It's really difficult, to take anything they say seriously when they're telling you that you should concentrate on other things. They featured 9 times more articles written about bikinis than domestic abuse. They had 961 news stories about thongs, which is almost 3 times the number of those written about childbirth. Lots of Sun journalists actually, to try and silence us, would say, why don't you concentrate on FGM? FGM had become this sort of buzzword during that period. And they kept telling us that, we should focus our efforts on that, which of course we did. We lent our support to other campaigns that were focusing on FGM, but I thought it was very telling that on the Sun's website, there were only 120 news stories about FGM, which is female genital mutilation for anyone who doesn't know. But there were 120 news stories about it in the Sun, which were obviously buried beneath the 7,000 articles about boobs, of course. But today I went and looked on the Sun's website, and I hadn't done this before, and it was really interesting because the rates are much more what you would want them to be, much more what you would expect them to be from a news outlet that claims to bring you the stories and information that matter to our lives. So if you look up the word rape, there's 900 articles, sexual assault, there's 400, domestic violence, 130. And if we look up the words boob, babe, and sexy, there's not more than 2,000 articles with those words in them. So I thought that was really interesting to see that even on the online content, they were adjusting things as a result of pressure that's been put on them by, various campaigns and ours, of course. Another thing that happened during our campaign was that the Daily Star's website had a sort of page 3 feature online, and very often underneath the images there would be these gruesome and violent comments from the users about the women's bodies, about what they wanted to do to the various women that were on the websites. One of our team members, who's a nurse, again a volunteer, she wrote a little blog about it, about the fact that we were often silenced and told that objectifying images of women and violence against women weren't hand in hand, that one did not foster the other. And when we brought to light some of these really incredibly violent comments, bearing in mind that these were moderated, so these were the comments that were actually allowed on the website, the next day the website disabled commenting completely. So people are no longer allowed to leave misogynist and horrifyingly violent comments underneath, this titillating imagery of women, which again I think is a really important thing, because, if we're online and we're looking at things, and especially young people, and they're seeing this violent language associated with sexual imagery, it's not a good thing. It shouldn't be allowed, and it's slowly we're changing minds about what, the correct way to sort of operate online. Which I think is really interesting. When we polled our supporters, so before I came here, we did a little poll on our supporters to try and find out if they thought anything had changed in the media since our campaign, since our win. And 17% of them said they thought the representation of women had gotten worse. 42% said they thought it was the same, and 41% said they thought it had gotten better. I think the Olympics are always a really good litmus test for how women are represented in the media, and there wasn't much difference this time round. And we had John Inverdale putting his foot in it again, like he seems to do in every sporting event, and forgetting about the existence of women in the world of tennis. So, yeah, I do think it's an interesting measure for the representation of women, certainly sport. I think that what we did achieve that was the most important thing as a campaign is that we sort of mobilised a generation of young women and young men as well, but predominantly young women, and we showed them that their voices matter, that they can change things with their words. And we do live in an amazing time. You can become an activist, in a few minutes on Twitter if you join in a conversation, or on Facebook, And so I think that we've encouraged the younger generation certainly to make their voices heard. We had a motto, and I think it was Arthur Ashe who said this: start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And we also had another motto, which was go big or go home, which was really useful when we made our somewhat enthusiastic and misguided bid for Christmas #1 in 2014. But the representation of women in the media in the UK is actually symptomatic of a system that wants to repress any dissenting voices. We don't want to represent women in their full humanity, because then we'd have to represent all humans in their full humanity, and we don't want to do that. They want to sort of annihilate any idea that strays from the cultural hegemony, and the representation of women is just a symptom of that. They want to make sure that the debate stays precisely in the middle ground, and the way that they do that is using stereotypes over reality to tell stories that are far from the truth. The vilification of refugees, benefit claimants, the objectification of women, the sensationalising of violence and sexual violence against women, it's all part of this public spectacle and entertainment package that's being created to distract people from the real issues. The media coverage of female Olympians is the perfect metaphor, actually, I think. The obscenely rich and powerful elite white men who run our media don't ever want the women to run as fast as them. But we can, and this is a really important point, something that made our campaign very powerful was the words that other organisations were willing to lend to us. It legitimised us, and it meant the mainstream media couldn't ignore us. When we had quotes from Women's Aid, Rape Crisis, the Girl Guide, they could no longer silence us and tell us that as an issue it didn't matter, when all the charities and organisations in the UK tasked with looking after women and girls were saying actually it does matter. And so I think that as a movement, what we should be doing, all of these movements in the room, we should be working together and supporting each other. And that's a really, really important thing, because without that, none of us will ever get anywhere. So that's the message that I want to leave everybody with. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela, and that is a very important message, I think, to leave us with. And at the Media Reform Coalition, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do, and very, in a way that's very under-resourced and under-supported, is to reach out as much as possible to all sorts of organisations, beyond the usual suspects within media campaigning issues. Next up, we have Chris Nineham, who's a founding member and national officer of the Stop the War Coalition. He was one of the main organisers of the biggest ever national demonstration in this country that took place in the eve of the Gulf War in 2003. But he's also published widely both on progressive political movements as well as on media and cultural theory, and we're extremely grateful he's able to join the platform on such notice. Chris.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Justin. Thanks for everyone for coming, and for all the organisers. I do think things have got worse on this front, and I'll come on to that. But I just wanted to emphasise that, it was ever thus, really, as well. I've got a quote here from '91 where the Sun's comment, Richard Littlejohn, actually, someone you know and love, no doubt, was commenting on the demonstrations back in the day against the Gulf War #1, where he says, as the UN deadline passed, out crawled the usual collection of students, in inverted commas, God botherers, Guardian readers, gays, communists, trots, men with beards and duffel coats, men with ponytails, women in men's shoes, and old hippies with worn-out Country Joe and the Fish LPs. So, you know, it's nothing new, while I do think, as I say, things are getting worse. And one of the things that really stands out from the point of view of the movements and sort of being on the receiving end, and you probably all agree, is so wildly inconsistent and illogical, because most of the time, the media just completely ignores protest movements. You know, it's as if you're not there. You know, you can have massive demonstrations, there's no reportage, whereas PMQs gets covered every week. But then suddenly the thing shifts and you get this torrent of kind of unwanted attention about something completely mad, which doesn't help you at all. And, you know, that can be the experience. Like, for example, last year, at the end of last year, we had this kind of concocted controversy, which became an absolute chorus from the media, which basically amounted to one question: is Jeremy Corbyn coming to your Christmas dinner? And, you know, the phone was ringing off the hook from the Daily Mail to the BBC to the Telegraph, right across a whole lot of weird and wonderful websites that you'd never heard of before. And, you know, that's the sort of dichotomy. When you do get the attention, very often it's because they're really having a go at you. And yet, when they ignore you, they're presumably assuming that you're not important. And I think that one of the things that really hit home, certainly to us last year, was, and one of the things that's quite sinister and worrying about the whole situation, is the extent to which the attacks appear to be coordinated. I mean, no doubt to some extent this is spontaneous, but, you know, it was literally the case that, you know, all these sort of senior, apparently serious political journalists were asking this question about the Christmas dinner, which was just ridiculous. You know, yes, it's Christmas, he's a friend of ours, he's coming to dinner. You know, it wasn't really a news story at all, yet it became one. They managed to manufacture it as an item, as a thing. And, you know, you find this right across the board. I mean, on the issue of Syria, we get asked the same question every single time by every single outlet, which is basically, you know, if you're, but if you're against bombing the Syrian people, you must be for doing nothing. Isn't it wrong to just leave the Syrian people to their own devices? Which is completely illogical, because there are other foreign policies other than massacring large numbers of innocent people. You know, they are available. And yet that idea doesn't come into the discussion. And, you know, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but on the other hand, I think one of the things we have to kind of factor into the situation now is that it's not just that the media is tremendously biased against the movements, the protest movements, and also against Jeremy Corbyn. They've become, or sections of them, particularly the BBC and I think to some extent the Guardian, they've become organising centres for the opposition. You know, they've gone beyond just reflecting prejudice towards kind of generating antipathy, hostility and antagonism towards progressive politics. Now, you know, there's lots to discuss here, and, you know, partly this is just the natural product of the fact that these people are from the elites. They don't like radical ideas. A lot of them are from the elites. Sorry, I don't mean to generalise, but I mean, if you look at the kind of class background, social background, a lot of these journalists, it's clear that they're very much from a bubble, and they instinctively don't like the politics. I think when it comes to the movements, they particularly don't like the combination of radicalism and popular participation, which is sort of super anathema to them. And one of the things about the Jeremy Corbyn dinner and that whole thing last year is that they hate Corbyn and they hate movements, but the idea that we might one day have a prime minister who actually kind of not just goes on demos but organises them is their worst nightmare, you know. I think that's part of it. But just to think about what's happened recently and why it's got so bad, I think you have to look at the fact that, you know, since over the last couple of decades, really, we had a situation where the political consensus has massively narrowed, the political kind of spectrum has massively narrowed. And that's what Blairism was all about, you know, the kind of consensus around free market politics, the consensus around pro-war politics, which has always been there in a sense, but has got so much worse, or had got so much worse, had created this situation where, you know, they really did believe the end of history narrative. They really did believe the end of the working class narrative. They really did believe that big ideas were finished and socialism was something that had been well and truly buried. And for it suddenly to re-erupt in this way, I think is deeply disturbing for them. And I think that's part of the situation that we face. And another way to look at it, and I'll draw my comments to a close here, but another way to look at it is to kind of stand back a bit and say, this is really partly about the limitations of democracy in modern society. Because, and I think this is a very, this is something that we do have to factor into what we're thinking about. Because, there are whole sections or whole elements of the power structure that are completely devoid of any kind of accountability, that are that have no democratic element to them whatsoever. And the media is one of them, and the judiciary is another, and the army is another, and the police is another. And really, I think we have to think of the media as part of a state that is, it's corporate, but it's also kind of official and governmental. And, it is a democracy-free domain. And it seems to me that any radical movement, any radical project that is serious about trying to change things has got to start to develop a strategy to challenge that problem. Because we're going to see more of it. I mean, if you think the attacks on Corbyn are bad at the moment, I tell you, if he, and I think he can, gets anywhere near the prospect of being elected, what we have seen up to now will be like an afternoon tea party compared to the torrent of hatred, abuse and vilification that will be, not just by the media actually, but by all arms of the state. And I think we really do have to start thinking about how we deal with that situation, because the way we respond to it is critical. And there's one response, and I do want to say this, there's one response to this situation which I think is very dangerous, which can become a kind of self-fulfilling analysis, which is to say, the media is so powerful, the corporate media is so powerful, the BBC is so powerful, that in a way we have to play to some of their prejudices. And people say, Jeremy really shouldn't be opposing Trident, because, the media is going to say that's just beyond the pale. Jeremy shouldn't be saying that he wouldn't press the button. Jeremy shouldn't be opposing NATO. And I think that the problem is the outcome of that kind of thinking is actually to reinforce the power of the media. That's what happens. So if we have this image that the media is all powerful and that it does shape everyone's opinion and that there really isn't anything we can do, then, in the end of the day, they've won. And I just want to really end by saying that, I very, very much agree with Angela's points that she made in her presentation, which is that, actually they're nothing like as powerful as they think they are, and as lots of people on the left tend to think of them. I think the left is in awe of the ruling class's persuasive powers unnecessarily, and there's so much evidence, and very much so recently, that actually people make their own minds up about a lot of this stuff. And people decide things on the basis of their own experience. Look at Brexit, whatever people may think. The fact of the matter is most of the media was against it. Look at Corbyn himself. The media has been mounting a massive campaign, second to none, to try and overturn the original vote, and yet it looks almost certain now as if they're going to fail. So it's not true that the media is all powerful. And I want to end very finally on my own experience from the anti-war movement, because what was very interesting about the period just up in the run-up to the Iraq War was that, weirdly, at the last moment, the kind of polls began to reverse a little bit. And because the movement became so big, the lines of communication became kind of jumbled and confused. And actually, the message started to fall apart. And we had the situation in the run-up to the big demo in 2003, where the media was promoting the demonstration. The Mirror phoned us up and said, can we produce placards for your demo, please? We had maps in the Evening Standard, in the Guardian, in all the major papers. They put maps in a couple of days before saying where to march. And I remember the thing that really stuck in my mind was watching the news the weather the night before the demo. And it always strikes me that the BBC weather is the most kind of, middling thing. I don't know why, I always think of it like that. It's a very, very sort of conventional thing. And the weatherman actually said, and I thought I was dreaming or something, actually said the night before, it's going to be really cold tomorrow, so if you're going on the demo, you better wrap up. I just think, what is going on here? But that, to me, was an example of the extent to which a really mass movement has the capacity to kind of reverse the kind of communicate, or at least, as I say, scramble the ideological apparatus. And, you know, although obviously we didn't stop the war back in 2003, the fact of the matter is that now, in British society, when the government wants to take us to war, it knows it faces protests, it knows it faces actually, normally, majority opposition to that war, and it knows that every time it tries to launch a war, there's going to be a mini crisis. And that's because actually we have a situation in British society, which if you think about it is pretty incredible, where the majority of people are really against imperialist wars.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I think that highlights really what has been a theme for, amongst all the speakers tonight, which is, you know, the challenge of not just diagnosing the problem in all its complexities, but also coming up with solutions, which hopefully we'll get onto in our discussion. But before that, we have one more speaker who really doesn't need an introduction, especially to an audience like this. He's not only an acclaimed filmmaker and tireless activist, but also an all-too-rare voice of radical dissent and genuine compassion within popular culture, Ken Loach.
Thanks very much. I think it's a really important meeting, discussing a really important subject. And the research that has been done by the Media Reform Coalition is really important, and I trust everybody will get hold of it on their phone or Bluetooth or internet or whatever it is and read it, because it's ammunition. It's ammunition in demonstrating that we have a real problem in getting a fair representation for Jeremy Corbyn and the whole new movement in the Labour Party. There have been some terrific things said, and I don't want to repeat stuff that you've already heard, but I think it's quite interesting to, we've talked about media bias, it's quite interesting to think, well, just what is this in practice? Because what are we missing, and how are they manipulating the ideas that they're transmitting? How come how are they attempting to manipulate our people's consciousness? Because I think it's quite specific. It is partly, of course, that they have people on who will attack Jeremy Corbyn, yes. But it's also how the presenters, how the anchors, how the commentators present the questions, how the questions they ask, the subtext to what they're asking, how they put stories together, and so that there is almost a collage of words and ideas and questions that together transmit the point of view they want you to have. So that's the first point I wanted to make, with just one or two examples. Now, you will have known, or maybe you won't, that Jeremy Corbyn had a series of press conferences in the last couple of weeks in which he outlined various policies. Now, in any normal election, the policies the candidates stand on would be the basis for the discussion. That's what you would argue about. That's where people would say, yes, that's a good policy, no, it's a bad policy. What's interesting here is that they weren't reported. Now, there was a press conference headed Secure Our National Health Service and Social Care. And there were some really important things said. I scoured the paper, I scoured The Guardian, I listened to quite as many of the news reports as I could. I didn't hear a word of this. Now tell me if you heard this. Did you hear that he would end health service privatisation and bring services into a secure, publicly provided NHS? integrate the National Health Service and social care for older and disabled people, introduce legislation to unpick 25 years of marketisation, end the purchaser-provider split, return the NHS to an accountable public. I didn't hear that. Did you hear that there would be a national investment bank to buy out organisations from their PFI schemes? A very precise commitment. PFI, we know, is draining the resources of National Health Service and the education services with the buildings that have been put up and rip us off. There's a precise commitment, not discussed. Parity for mental health, and so on. Abolish the cap on public sector pay increase. Now there's a huge issue for people who work in the public sector. There's a commitment. I didn't hear about it. I didn't hear about it until I asked today. We discovered these documents. Didn't hear about it. End 0 hours contracts. Lift the statutory minimum wage to the living wage. So that was help. Didn't hear a word. Now I was also asked to provide an endorsement for the news conference about the arts, which I did, and I was pleased to do, because it promised to give the arts the prominence that they had in the 1945 election manifesto. Really put the arts right at the centre of our common experience. An entitlement to theatre, music, and so on, to the people. Not so that it has to be sponsored by Shell, or you can't have an artistic function unless it's sponsored by a big corporation. An end to that, and particularly establishing minimum sectors of pay for people in the artistic and creative industry is really important in my business, where people in films young people are crucified. They're being told, for the benefit of your for the benefit of your CV, you have to work for nothing. Okay, you've got to work for nothing to get a CV. Corbyn's Labour Party would introduce a living wage for people in those industries, and particularly for those people who have marched to defend the libraries. A guarantee, a commitment to reopen public libraries. That's a big issue for a lot of communities. A big issue. Didn't hear a word of that. Not a word. And finally, energy. I could go on. Time is short. I won't go through it all. But a big press conference on energy and the environment. Really precise commitments here. The creation of over 200 local energy companies, giving towns, cities and localities the powers they need to drive a clean, locally accountable energy system. 200 local energy companies. Now that's quite precise. You would think they would examine that. You would think they would say, well, how are you going to make this work? Silence. And that failure, and this is particularly true for the BBC, which should be our national broadcasting institution of record. If those issues, those precise commitments are not in the public domain, that's a serious loss for our democratic process. So I think the BBC in particular, and of course the Guardian tucked a bit of it away in some remote corner after they finished taking the picture of Jeremy sitting on the train floor. Tucked away. Okay, so that's the failure to report. There's 2 or 3 points where they've taken an issue and presented their view of it in the way they do it. Think of the deselection of MPs. Now, the deselection of MPs is presented as a threat. Will you promise not to deselect MPs? Is the substance of that's their line. Now, think about that. The right to oppose that, of course, is that the Labour Party members have the right to be represented by somebody they choose. That's the right. Being an MP is not a job for life. But that's not the inference of the way they present it. Think about the purge. Now, the purge has been extraordinary. I've never known anything like it. Well, I don't even apply because I know I won't be accepted. Too dangerous. But the people are being purged all over the place. We know they're being purged. People are being purged for retweeting something Caroline Lucas said or something, where the policies overlap to a great extent, particularly with Jeremy as leader. People are being purged for ridiculous reasons. The BBC I heard them run one story about a purge. Guess whose story it was? The guy who claimed that Jeremy Corbyn supporters were like Nazi stormtroopers. He was purged, and that's the story they ran. That's the story they ran. What was his name? Michael Fisher, is it? Or Foster? Right. Should go to Gloucester. Michael Foster. He was purged, and that was the story, and it was on the Sunday Politics programme, I believe. And John McDonnell was on, and John McDonnell said he opposed purges, but the inference of the story was that it was Corbyn supporters that were doing the purging. That was the inference, when we know the opposite is the truth, and there's been no investigation into that. And that's an absolute way in which one story, which is absolutely supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, is twisted so that it's, in a perverse way, works against him. Take the other issue. A quarter to a third of the members are excluded from voting. Now, just imagine, if that had been a Corbyn group, had excluded a third to a quarter of the members, that would have been the story day after day after day. It would have been like the miners' ballot in the miners' strike. It would have driven this campaign remorselessly. But because it was the right wing that cut them out, doesn't exist anymore. Doesn't exist anymore. It's not there. The story doesn't exist. And one last one, the NHS. Now, 2 days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, there was a story in the press, a big story, they ran the story, that there was a report about the NHS that said that it was chronically underfunded. It would have to ration basic procedures. Non-emergency procedures would get cancelled. The money wasn't there. It was underfunded. I guess everybody remembers that story, right? Isn't it strange that the junior doctors have been saying this week after week for months and months and months, and the only question they're asked is, how can you put patients' lives at risk? That's the only question they're asked. So how come, when there is independent evidence that what they're saying is true, you don't get a junior doctor within 100 miles of the BBC? Not asked. And that's how they make certain that the information that you receive is nothing to do with the junior doctor's strike. And it takes you a moment to actually always put two and two together. But it's really important that we do, because that's how they do it. That's how they twist us. And they will go on doing it, and they will do it and do it and do it because the BBC, as has been said, is an arm of the state. The BBC is not some objective chronicler of the time, it is an arm of the state. And it was set in stone, the procedure, very early on, in 1926. I think there was still the British Broadcasting Company. Greg will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. And Reith, during the general strike, sat in a government office and received his instructions about what to broadcast from the government. But Churchill had wanted to use it as a direct propaganda machine, and Baldwin, the Prime Minister, said, no, he said, much better they think we're independent than they believe us. And that's what they did. And they have this pretense of objectivity where, in fact, it is propaganda on behalf of the broader interests of the state. So they might well be against a particular issue of a particular government, but they represent what are seen as the broader interests of the state. And I think that's really important that we have to understand their constitutional position. Why is Jeremy Corbyn so attacked? I think this has been talked about, but I think, to me, it is because he is the first Labour leader since its inception that is a real threat to capital. Every other Labour leader has adopted the position the boss has got to make a profit before we can have our services. Even the welfare state founded under Attlee was there to provide a secure, healthy, well-housed working class that would do the jobs to rebuild the country, the economy. And proof of that, Churchill and Macmillan and the people who followed, they left it in place. They left it in place because that's what capital needed then. Then came Thatcher, then came the neoliberals, then came the rampant expansion of capital, and they don't want it now. Capital now has to expand. It has to expand into our public services, into housing, into health, into transport, into everything, into the police force. Everywhere capital has to expand. Now, if you have a Labour Party that says, well, actually, we're going to kick you out of the health service, we're going to kick you out of transport, you're not going to be building houses, we're going to do it by direct labour. If a Labour leader is so going to restrict what capital can do, then they're going to make enemies. And if you add to that, to destabilise what the West sees as its nuclear arsenal, and we're going to remove ours, the whole arms industry, the whole complex is going to be after him, after them, after us. So I think it was right to say that the dirty tricks we've seen so far is kindergarten stuff. Just think of the enemies that the Labour Party will have. The international monetary organisations, the World Bank, the IMF, the whole European Union, bureaucracy at the top that have destroyed Greece, plus the military complex. So it's a huge, if we really make progress, we've got to really think very clearly about how we're going to fight back. And we've got to be prepared for every dirty trick that's going. And I think that what was said was quite right, that it has to be a mass movement, and the strides that have been made in that are absolutely extraordinary. And I think James and the many people working in Momentum have done an amazing job, something I would never have imagined was possible. Have done an amazing job, and it has to be a mass movement. I think Greg was right. There are some things that we can do in the short term. I mean, I think it's worth doing. And if you saw me fiddling with my phone, it wasn't to receive calls, it was just to write down the number. If you've got a pencil and paper, by the way, this is the number if you want a BBC complaint. It is, you probably got it, but jot it down, 037 00 100 222. I'll say it again at the end of the broadcast. That is, and the first option you'll get will be, do you want to make a comment? Don't go there. The second one will be, do you want to say something nice? Don't go there. The third one will be, do you want to make a complaint? You get to very nice people. They were working from the north of Ireland last time I spoke to them, and they write down what you say and they put it on the duty log. So it's worth it. Well, it's worth it. It makes you feel better. It may be useless, but it makes you feel better. 037 00 100 222. Give it a whirl. Okay. But it's down to match membership. I've spoken too long. The one thing I think we have to do for the long term is to think about a media policy so that we're not just complaining. The media policy that to democratize the press, that the freedom of the press is not the freedom of rich people to own papers to put forward their own propaganda. That is not the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press, it has to be, it's only me speaking personally, but I would suggest ideas we put forward include that to have a license to run a newspaper, you have to be a collective of journalists and also people who work on the paper. No test for what you think, no test for what you're going to write. But it has to be collective of people who have that consensus or think that their idea of running a paper is worth doing. That's who should run papers. Collectives of journalists and people who would agree with them or want to work with them, from the cleaners upwards. The BBC, public broadcasting is absolutely vital, but don't link it to the way the BBC is now. And we defend public service broadcasting, but it must be democratized by the people who work there and have an input from the communities who, in different parts of the country, and from the wider society. But it must have a democratic element, not the top-down, appointed by the state, appointed by the government, appoints the news editors, appoints a safe pair of hands. We can do it, but don't underestimate the size of the task. And as Greg said, this is a historic moment. It's a historic moment because we have a sliver of opportunity to change the Labour Party, to make it the Labour Party the Labour movement has always needed. Never happened in my lifetime. I don't think it's been there since the start of the Labour Representation Committee over 100 years ago. It's an extraordinary political moment, and we have to stick with it, and we have to see it through. We can do it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ken. We're going to get straight on to questions because we run a little short of time, but we're going to just stay until they kick us out. We will. Do we have any volunteers with a mic? I think unfortunately we only have one roving mic, but we'll take as many comments or questions as possible. If I could just ask you, in the interest of allowing as many people to speak as possible, to try and keep your comments and questions as concise as you can, and then we'll try and get speakers to respond at the end.
3 very swift questions, one for James, one for Angela, one for Ken. James, The Economist this week is running a story about post-truth politics, particularly with regard to the alt-right in America and Brexit in the UK. What kind of artillery do you have in mind for social movements such as yourself in response to post-truth politics, something that's not being covered this evening? Angela, what do you think about the representation of women amongst the left recently? MPs like Jess Phillips, Chion Wura has complained about minority female relationships on the left. And then Ken, just finally, you said that Jeremy is opposed to capital, but Brexit, however, was a revolt against transnational global capital, and Jeremy did support the Remain camp. So just a comment on that, please.
I learned today that the children's poet and outspoken socialist Michael Rosen has been kicked out of the Labour Party for apparently being a closet conservative. So he's apparently as a supporter of David Cameron, and my question though is, there are so many stories like this, and I don't understand why they don't catch. These stories could make for such great works of art, but just in terms of the memes online and young journalists writing about these stories, I don't understand what's stopping them from getting out there.
Yeah, Mark Wadsworth, and last time I spoke at a public meeting, Jeremy was there, my old friend from before he was elected in 1983. It made headlines as Smithgate, so you may know me. I think it should be called Smeargate because I was smeared. And out of that debacle, if you like to call it that, I mean, I was immediately expelled from the party for daring to challenge a right-wing Labour MP consorting with the Daily Telegraph. But out of that was something positive. You know, the points that James Schneider has made, and my old friend Greg Philo. There is support online from people writing in was overwhelming in favour of my stand, from Jewish and non-Jewish people. Pity that that wasn't then reflected in the newspapers. But that was a non-story, really. You know, I didn't mention anything to do with Jewish people or anti-Semitism, yet I was called by Ruth Smith a vile anti-Semite in what was effectively a setup. I was told by George Galloway, if it hadn't been me that day, it would have been somebody else. Because the vitriol against Jeremy is just incredible, as we all know in this room, and I was collateral damage. But I just want to say that it was really positive to have all of that support. I am fighting that suspension along with 100 of others. A lot of them are Muslims, by the way, and I hope I can count on all your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. My name is Anne, and I'm from the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, and we're very pleased to be able to support this meeting this evening. The organisation was formed in the late 70s, early 80s, as a consequence of a massive series of campaigns, not just about media content, but about media ownership. And it's amazing that with the developments that have taken place, that once again there is a big becoming mainstream movement questioning the manipulation and the distortion and the filth that's produced. But there is one thing that every single person in this room can do to really help meld together and mix together the campaign for improved media, better media, media democracy, democratise the press and the media, and also have some influence and effect on the filth and on the ownership. And that is every single person, every media worker bound together in a trade union. Media workers worldwide, historically, are the most progressive of workers and the most powerful of workers, because we organise, we are the manipulators following the orders of our employers. Even if we're self-employed, even if we're casually employed, even if we're employed with no pay either, i.e. internships, we are the purveyors of the filth. And we have a responsibility as workers to try to do something about it. And the only effective way that workers can do something about it is joining their trade union as well as acting in the community with others in organisations such as are represented here. So I would urge everybody in the room, as well as intensifying efforts with all of these fantastic campaigns that are emerging, is to do your bit by joining either the NUJ or Unite, which represents most of the other workers in IT and in press and media, BECTU, the Musicians Union, and all other trade unions that are appropriate to the section that you're in. Because that is the way that you can influence other workers. That's the way that you can turn into action some of the demands that are being made. And by developing and organising at the place of work, we can also strike at the heart of the big media monopoly owners, the Murdochs, the Associated Newspapers, the Trinity Mirrors of the world, and the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles and so on. So I implore everybody, show your power, show your strengths, and combine with others by joining the right media trade union. Thank you.
Much. We're really good, and I'm really glad for your list of things to do, Greg. Really helpful. I wanted to make a short comment and a question. Now, in terms of the bias in the media, one clear example was the way that the 44 women MPs who complained about abuse and somehow blamed Jeremy Corbyn for it, that he wasn't doing enough about it, was covered. Well, and also the fact that somehow the first shadow cabinet that had a majority of women was sexist because there wasn't a woman in charge. I mean, that is such an extraordinary thing. The first shadow cabinet that's a majority of women somehow turns out to be sexist. On the other hand, the fact that anti-austerity is the most anti-sexist policy that can be put forward and that has been put forward given that the austerity cuts have been paid 85% of them by women, something that we hear very little about. So the fact that Jeremy's anti-austerity policy is anti-sexist, we haven't heard too much about, not from the women MPs and certainly not from the media. So there's another example. Now, I have a question about the media workers' unions. None of you have mentioned them, and the speaker here, the woman who just spoke, said something about that. But what do you think is their role in all this? Because we don't hear a lot about them, frankly. And in fact, some of them have sided straight against Jeremy, and those articles that are written, presumably a number of them are written by union members, the ones that attack Jeremy and the membership.
Thank you to everybody. I just want to add a little bit of things that people can do. I'm on the board of directors of Hacked Off, and 5 years ago we had a very small glimmer of hope where we actually thought we were going to develop a system of press regulation that was independent and would hold them to account. We now are in a position where the previous Secretary of State for Culture and Media and Sport said that he was not minded to bring in the final part of that legislation, Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, that would actually introduce the costs and incentives that would encourage the press to behave more responsibly. We now have a new Minister for Culture, Media and Sport, Karen Bradley, and she is currently taking consultation advice on what she should do about Section 40. So I would urge every single person here to write to Karen Bradley and say, this is part of a system of press regulation that was voted on unanimously in Parliament, that was agreed by about 70 to 80% of the population, that the powers that be in the press have simply refused to play ball with, and they held, of course, a sword of Damocles over Whittingdale in relation to the scandal that he was involved in at the time. So we need that Section 40 to be enacted, and we need, in order that IPSO, the current press regulator, can actually be shown up for the sham that it is, and that another press regulator can come into place and those costs and incentives will start. Without that, it really is a kind of one step. If we don't get Section 40 now, it's a hell of a long way to get back to that position. So please write to Karen Bradley, write to your MP and say Section 40, just commence it. It's already enacted, just needs commencing. Start that process.
Thanks very much for the talk and more importantly the education. My name is Munir. I come from Barnet Momentum, or I'm part of Barnet Momentum. I just wanted to make a couple of suggestions, because two of the themes that have come out from tonight is, one, shining a spotlight on the media, and two, underrepresentation of the campaign. As we saw in Sky News yesterday, I think it took over an hour for someone from the Jeremy Corbyn campaign to have a comment. By then I changed over to Champions League football. From those two themes, then I would suggest we look at organization and mobilization, because we talked about 500,000, 600,000 members. And two of the suggestions would be to follow in the shoes of the Calling for Jeremy campaign, because it's been very good in taking a list, creating an app and allowing people to work from home. So if you want people to complain, call the BBC, read specific articles, then perhaps set up a group of people that can set up something on the computer that will allow people to download at home that is properly organized, and then people can make an impact, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to just pull together all these ideas to the different parts of the country. The second suggestion is, Ken Loach mentioned that there isn't a discussion on policy in terms of some of the great ideas that have been coming out. And I'd probably say thank goodness for that, because some of these issues are very, very complex. Even to unravel PFI is not something that's easy. So the other suggestion would be to start to get groups of experts in particular areas, you know, I mean experts, not just people who know about these things, who can also be trained and when it's needed, come in front of the media and argue that position from a technical point of view?
Two things. One is to enforce what has been said about phone banking. I went quite a few times at Unite, and it's quite an experience. First of all, it's led by women. I mean, it's something that must be said, okay? Women are running it, okay? Women are running it. They're running the phone bank at Unite. It's important to be said because we see very, very often the women's role gets completely obscured. And you learn a lot because you meet a lot of people there, LGBTQ people, black people, straight men, gay men, etc. And you learn because you learn to speak to people, and people are sometimes very funny or very weird or very strange. They don't answer the phone. I mean, it's something that you have to learn. And I learned because I didn't know. And I found it but the other thing is this. I think that there is a scope for international connections that have not been drawn. I was very glad that reading Manifesto, I'm Italian, I read Manifesto, there was an interview with Loach, which I thought was very good, and a good start, because this movement is not known all over Europe. It's not known in the United States, okay? And there is a potential for this movement to become a point of reference for international struggle, and we have to think how to influence the media outside the UK and make them realize that this is very important, because my experience is, I'm sorry about this, there is a big difference between the Anglo-Saxon countries and the Mediterranean countries, between the Spanish-speaking people and the English-speaking people. They don't talk to each other. Okay?
Thank you very much.
I think the media has got a hell of a lot worse than this last year. We've seen this incredible slander against Jeremy Corbyn right from the minute he was looking like being leader. And then we've had this huge anti-immigration campaign leading up to Brexit. It's been utterly shocking. And we've got to try and do more. It's not possible to start a new newspaper. It's not possible to start a new TV station. But it is possible to start an online daily newspaper with a media app for mobiles. This is quite possible, and I've been working on it for some months. I've got a colleague now who's willing to put up the funds to start just as a big demo site, which we can get going. We need more help. If anyone's interested in helping, anyone interested in finding out, please give me your email or ask my card. Thank you very much.
Hello, I just have a quick suggestion. I read a lot about message discipline, and I think that is something that we do lack on the left. We have a huge range of views, and I was just thinking perhaps it would be good to create and distribute a toolkit that would help people actually address the key issues and the key policies, and also give people avenues and quick ideas of how to kind of complain and hold the media to account.
Hiya, I've got a couple of questions for James. So when it comes to BBC bias, Ofcom is obviously supposed to be regulating it. Ofcom's supposed to be regulating it. So what do you think is going on, and why do you think it's staying silent? Okay, so when it comes to BBC bias,
I think, yeah, I'll probably have to just translate the question, just if you could just ask it as quickly as possible.
Alright, so when it comes to BBC bias, Ofcom is supposed to regulate it, so what's going on? Why is it staying silent? And have you or Jeremy or Momentum or the campaign at all ever made complaints about Ofcom and what it does? And one other question.
2 seconds.
And also Ken was talking about Jeremy's policy not getting coverage, and I'd like to know what do you imagine those conversations to be like in newsrooms between editors and their reporters when they're saying, no, you should ignore this policy stuff?
What do I imagine?
Yeah, what do you imagine those conversations to be like?
Okay, I'm just going to give whoever wants to, from the platform, to address any of those questions or comments. We've run out of time, but as quickly as possible. Greg?
We did a whole toolkit for all our work on the wealth tax, which is very easily adapted. So if you go on to just Google Glasgow University Media Group, that will take you to our website, and there's quite a big toolkit there with how to actually get messages across, how to organise it. I take your point, and I think we should work on that. But just for the moment, the Media Group website's got a lot on it on that kind of issue. Okay, right. I'll finish.
James, do you want to respond to some questions?
Yeah, great, good idea. That will happen in some form. I'm not an expert on Ofcom. I think maybe Greg would be better to talk about its strengths and failures. What do I imagine newsroom discussions are like? Well, I get told what they're like because not everyone in the. I mean, there are people who are more broadly supportive of politics who are in newsrooms. Lots of time there's a struggle that goes on. There are discussions. There are people who say we want to do things very much like this. Generally, younger people, less well paid, less secure contracts, who are more likely to push back. And I think what I was trying to suggest is how can you strengthen the hand of those people who are in there, who are pushing for things in their news conferences to be better. And I think if we, the more we can build up a constituency that they have to listen to, is that. Just a couple other things that were raised. I'm going to be really fair to Sky for once. The reason why the Corbyn supporter wasn't on for an hour after the debate was logistical rather than editorial, so I'll be fair to them on that. Role of unions, I think what Ken said about democratising media, I think unions can play a massive role in that. And then the first question about post-truth politics. There was never truth politics. There wasn't an era of truth politics where the media was very fair and there weren't any of these difficulties. The difference that we have now, and the reason why we're hearing about this post-truth politics, is because there's a breakdown in confidence in elites and in systemic control. So when we saw in Brexit, during the Brexit debate, who were these experts that people were rejecting? They're the same experts, let's say from the IMF or OECD or so on, that people do not trust anymore because they've been saying we should have a particular set of economic policies which have failed drastically. Sometimes that has left possibilities and we have to use those, but of course that goes to the right as well, which is why you get the alt-right. Those are the morbid symptoms.
Yeah, just quickly, so to respond to your question about the representation of women on the left, I think that women's experiences, our bodies, everything like that has always been used as a vehicle by the media to push whatever agenda they want to push. So that's my opinion. Nothing that they say is accurate about women, essentially.
Just two things. One is I very much agree that one of the things we need to call out is the mobilisation of the language of anti-oppression by the right as a way to attack the left. And this has really become a thing. And we shouldn't fear it. We shouldn't be intimidated by it, because it is an attempt to intimidate people. We have a very, very strong set of arguments. And the main one is that when you look at Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn has a record of fighting racism, fighting sexism, fighting homophobia, fighting anti-Semitism. That is simply second to none right across that institution, and we need to say that, I think, whenever this comes forward. I mean, just in general, in the spirit of misquoting people, I think the Franklin Roosevelt's comment that something like, the main thing we have to fear is fear itself, is actually pertinent in this situation. It seems to me there's two ways we can address the problems we face. There's two ways we can think about it. One is, are we simply going to reflect public opinion, see public opinion as static, we just have to, do the opinion polls and follow where people are already at? Or are we going to try and shape it? That's the crucial question, and that's the million-dollar issue here. And it seems to me that, we are in a situation where the combination of a radical political program with mass participation in movements that include, all sorts of things, including the strike action that's beginning to take place now, including Black Lives Matter, including the anti-war movement, the pro-Palestine movement. If all of these people are participating and mobilised and in some senses linked to the political project around Jeremy Corbyn, given the level of anger and bitterness and alienation that exists in British society at the moment, we have a very good chance of winning, but we can only do it if we have that optimistic, outward-looking, dynamic approach.
I feel bad not saying anything, so I will. We need media strategies, of course. We need progressive media policies. I take it for granted as someone who helped found the Media Reform Coalition. But more than all of that, we need to give voice to the anger and alienation of ordinary people over a range of issues. And that means building the movements which will force themselves onto the stage in such a way that the media will find it very hard to ignore. They may try to ignore them, but our job, in as much as we want to develop the best approach to the media, is to actually build the grassroots and make sure that they explode into the public eye. And I think yesterday I heard some really good reporting. This is a contentious thing to say on this stage. I heard some great reporting on the BBC. Not because anyone had changed their mind, not because they were suddenly doing mea culpas about everything. It was they gave voice to what Jeremy Corbyn said about grammar schools because he annihilated the Prime Minister. He actually represented the views of millions of people. And even the BBC found it impossible to discredit, marginalise or ridicule him because he was speaking what millions of people think. If we then do that over a range of issues, not just about one person doing it, but about deep-rooted campaigns against injustice, against inequality, against austerity, I think that is the single best hope for producing a media reaction that will start to reflect what ordinary people think.
Stand up so that you can see me. Just to answer this gentleman question here and this lady over here, the tour that Justin mentioned earlier, that's Real Media alongside Media Reform Coalition, we're actually launching an app that aggregates independent news from places like Corporate Watch, New Internationalist, Novara Media, and there's also going to be local news in terms of London, Scotland, across cities, and also a place to find events where you can organise in your local areas, and that's going to be launched at the end of next month in the 10-city tour, so that's an option.
Yes, to answer the specific point that you made about the European Union and the campaign to stay in as being a sign that someone favoured capital, the interests of capital, I think it would be shared on the left that the European Union is a neoliberal organisation. It drives to privatisation, it drives to subcontracting and so on. But I think the reasons to stay in, as I understood it, were to maintain solidarity with left groups in Europe, on the one hand, but also because the alternative to leaving was a neoliberal government here, which would again, as investment left, would have to drive down wages and conditions in order to attract the investment that would have left because the companies were no longer had access to the European market. So I think it was a tactical question, and so I don't think it indicates support for the interests of capital. I think the general point that's been made, and I think in many forms, many times tonight, is that the how we deal with the media is linked to how we make a successful movement. And that means everyone contributing in their own constituencies, in their own campaigns, in their own communities, organising. And it's carrying out those grassroots campaigning projects. It's talking to people. It's whether we do it door to door, whether we do it in marketplaces, whether we do it in meetings, wherever we do it, whether we do it with phone-ins, whether we do it complaints, in whatever form, but we stay organised, we stay disciplined, we stay and we will become the real force that is already on the way. It's already on the way. I mean, over 500,000 is an extraordinary achievement in the face of this backstabbing and this undermining that's gone on. So I'm really confident for the first time in my very elderly life. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We've run over time. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers, to all of you coming out. Please do go away and act. There is all sorts of events coming up, as we mentioned. There's also a monthly meet-up on the first Tuesday of every month. First Wednesday of every month. We can find the information on meetups.org. There is an incredibly important need for everyone to do, not just to tweet and Facebook and share, but also, as we've heard, pick up the phone to the BBC, write to the Daily Express. Just do it on all fronts. Thank you. Keep the conversation going.